The day my director told me I wasn't ready for the senior project lead role, I was standing in the hallway outside the boardroom with a coffee going cold in my hand and 32 years of muscle memory telling me exactly what was about to go wrong with the Pemberton account. I nodded. I said, "I understand." I walked back to my desk and I started doing exactly what my job description said I was supposed to do. Nothing more. That was a Tuesday in early March. By Friday, our biggest client had escalated directly to the VP of Operations, and my phone had 54 missed calls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I spent 26 years in the Canadian Army, Royal Canadian Engineers, mostly doing the kind of work that doesn't show up in press releases. Bridging operations in the Balkans. Force support in Afghanistan. 2 years attached to NATO planning in Brussels. When I came home the last time, my wife looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You're done, aren't you?" Not a question. She's always known me better than I know myself. We'd been married since I was 24 years old, and she'd learned to read the particular kind of tired that I carry when I've used everything up. I retired at 49. Took about 8 months off. Then I got restless the way I always do, and a former colleague connected me with Vantage Infrastructure Solutions, a mid-sized firm out of Mississauga that handled project management and logistics consulting for municipal and provincial contracts. Roads, utilities, water treatment expansions. The kind of infrastructure work that actually holds a province together, even if nobody notices until something breaks. I came in as a senior consultant. The title wasn't important to me. The work was familiar. I understood timelines, resource constraints, the language of government procurement, the particular frustration of working with suppliers who promised one delivery window and meant another. Within 18 months, I was managing 4 concurrent contracts and mentoring 2 junior analysts who didn't yet understand why you always read the Schedule B addendum before you touch anything else. My director, I'll call him my director, was a decent enough man. He'd come up through the private sector, big commercial real estate background, and he genuinely didn't always understand the rhythm of public infrastructure work. That was fine. I filled the gap. I translated. When a project manager on the Elliott Lake water main expansion couldn't get through to him about a critical materials delay, she came to me. When the township of Severn had questions about the contract language on a drainage project, they called me directly even though I wasn't listed as the primary contact. I didn't mind. That's how it works when you've been around long enough. People learn who actually knows what's happening. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I wasn't bitter about any of this at the time. I wasn't secretly resentful, wasn't keeping a ledger. I genuinely liked the work and I genuinely liked most of the people. If anything, I was probably too comfortable. I'd found the kind of equilibrium where I knew my value even if the org chart didn't quite reflect it, and I'd made a private peace with that. Then they posted the senior project lead position. I'd been doing the job informally for most of 2 years. Everyone knew it. My director knew it. I wasn't arrogant about it. I put together a straightforward application, highlighted the contracts I'd managed, the client relationships I'd built, the Pemberton Regional Services account specifically, which had grown from a single water main feasibility study into a multi-phase municipal partnership worth somewhere north of $4 million over 3 years. I sat in the interview. I answered the questions. I thought it went well. The conversation with my director happened on a Monday morning. He called me into his office, closed the door, and he had the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say several times and is not fully confident in any of the drafts. He told me they'd decided to go in a different direction. He said they were looking for someone who could grow into the role over the next decade. He used the phrase long runway. He talked about fresh perspectives. He told me my contributions were invaluable and that he hoped I understood this wasn't a reflection of my performances. I let him finish. "Who'd you go with?" I asked. He told me. The name didn't mean much to me at first. Someone from the commercial sector, recently recruited, 33 years old. I found out later he was the son of one of the company's board members. Not a secret, exactly. Just not something that came up in my director's carefully rehearsed speech. I said I understood. I thanked him for his time. I went back to my desk, and I sat there for a while, looking at the Pemberton file open on my second monitor, thinking about the site assessment I needed to finalize by Thursday, and the permit amendment that was still sitting unsigned somewhere in the Simcoe County offices. That afternoon, I sent a brief email to HR requesting a copy of my current job description. I want to explain something about what I decided because I've seen the way this story gets told sometimes. Like it's about revenge, like I was out to hurt the company or prove a point. That's not what it was. It was simpler than that. If they decided my skills and experience weren't worth promoting, then it was genuinely time for me to stop providing services that exceeded my pay grade. I wasn't going to destroy anything. I wasn't going to be petty. I was going to do exactly what I was hired to do, at the level I was hired to do it, and nothing more. I read my job description carefully. I noted the specific responsibilities outlined in my contract. I identified everything I'd been doing that wasn't in that document. There was quite a lot. The Pemberton account, technically speaking, fell under the senior project lead portfolio. I'd been managing it informally because I'd been the one to build the relationship and because no one had ever formally reassigned it. As of that week, I flagged it to my director as requiring formal assignment. I did this professionally, in writing, noting that with the new senior project lead now in place, accountability should be clearly established. My director wrote back and said he'd sort it out. He didn't sort it out. The permit amendment for the Simcoe County drainage expansion, the one that had been sitting on someone's desk in Barry for 3 weeks, was technically outside my scope as a senior consultant on that contract. I'd been following up on it as a courtesy because I knew the county liaison personally, and because I understood that if it lapsed, the project timeline would shift by 6 weeks minimum. I stopped following up. I sent a brief note to the assigned project manager noting the file's status. What he did with that information was his business. 3 calls came in through the main line that first week for clients who'd been in the habit of asking for me specifically. Reception transferred them. I took the calls, listened, and explained politely that for anything related to active projects, they'd want to speak with the assigned project manager or the new senior project lead. I gave them the right names and numbers. I was pleasant about it. I just wasn't available to solve problems that weren't mine to solve. My wife noticed something had shifted before I said a word about it. We were cleaning up after dinner on the Thursday. Our youngest was at hockey. The house was quiet, and she said, "You seem lighter." "I'm doing my job," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Just your job?" "Just my job." She nodded slowly and handed me the dish towel. "How long before someone notices?" I said I wasn't sure. "Maybe a few weeks." It took 11 days. The Pemberton account was the first one to show cracks. I knew it would be. The quarterly review with the township's infrastructure committee was scheduled for the end of March, and the file had some nuances in it that needed careful handling. 3 years of relationship context, a particular sensitivity around the Phase 2 timeline that I'd managed delicately because the township's director of public works had his own political pressures I'd come to understand. The new senior project lead, I'll call him what he was, my director's boss's son, walked into that review without having read the full file history. I know this because the township coordinator, a woman I'd worked with since the project started, called the main line the next morning and asked to speak with me. I wasn't available. She escalated to my director. My director, to his credit, went into that meeting. But he didn't have the context either. The township raised a concern about a budget variance in the Phase 2 proposal that I had already addressed informally in a conversation 6 months earlier and was going to formalize in the quarterly report. Without that context, it looked like we'd missed something. It wasn't a disaster, but it cost 2 weeks of credibility recovery and an extra trip to Penetanguishene for a face-to-face that wouldn't have been necessary. The permit situation in Simcoe County was worse. I found out later, not from my director, from the project manager himself, who knocked on my office doorframe one afternoon looking like he'd aged 5 years, that the amendment had lapsed. The county had sent 2 reminder notices that went to an email inbox that hadn't been properly monitored after a staff transition. The project timeline shifted by 8 weeks. The client, a regional municipality with its own council reporting obligations, was not pleased. There were penalty clauses in the contract, not enormous, a few $1,000s, but the kind of thing that shows up in a contract performance review and stays there. I did my job. I finalized my deliverables on time. I attended every meeting I was required to attend. I was professional and responsive within the boundaries of my actual role. I wasn't difficult, wasn't cold, didn't make a scene. A few colleagues seemed to notice that I wasn't doing the extra things anymore. One of the junior analysts came to me with a question about a procurement regulation, and I answered it because that was within scope. When she followed up asking if I could review the full RFP before it went out, something I used to do routinely, something that wasn't in my job description, I told her she should run it by the senior project lead. She gave me a look. I kept my expression neutral. It was around week 3 that my director stopped by my desk. Casual, hands in his pockets, the way people do when they want to seem like they're not having a specific conversation. He asked how I was doing. I said I was doing well, thank you. He mentioned the Pemberton situation, said it had been a bit of a rough patch, but they were getting it sorted. I agreed that it sounded like it had been a rough patch. He mentioned the Simcoe permit. Said it was unfortunate. I said yes, permit timelines could be tricky to track without a proper system in place. There was a pause. He said something about how these things sometimes fell through the cracks when there were transitions happening. I said I understood completely. He left. I went back to my file. I want to pause here and say something honestly. There were moments during those weeks where I questioned myself. Not about whether I was wrong, I wasn't wrong, but about the cost. The junior analyst running that RFP had nothing to do with the promotion decision. The project manager who inherited the Simcoe file was a decent guy who'd been dropped into a situation he wasn't fully equipped for. I wasn't the one who'd created those problems. But I was aware that my stepping back had made certain things harder for people who didn't deserve the difficulty. I had a conversation with my wife about it one evening. I told her what I'd been thinking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you create those gaps, or did they?" I said that was a fair point. She said, "You've been filling holes that weren't yours to fill for 2 years. If the structure collapses when you stop, that's not on you." I knew she was right. I also knew it wasn't quite that simple, the way most things aren't quite that simple. But I kept doing my job. Just my job. Nothing more, nothing less. The call that changed things came on a Wednesday, the second week of April. I was driving back from a site visit near Barrie. Routine inspection on a completed culvert replacement, nothing complex, and my phone started going. I had it connected to the car. I watched the number come up the first time and recognized it as the office main line. Then again. Then my director's direct number. Then a number I didn't recognize. Then the main line again. I was on the highway. I let it go. By the time I got back to the office 2 hours later, I had 54 missed calls across my mobile and the desk extension voicemails. I found out what happened when I walked in and saw my director and the VP of operations standing in the hallway outside the glass-walled meeting room. Both of them with the particular expression of people who have been having a very bad morning. Pemberton Regional Services had called the VP directly. Not the general inquiry line, not the project manager. The VP's personal office number, which they had because the VP had done a site visit with the township mayor 18 months ago and exchanged cards. The Phase 2 contract had a renewal decision point in April. Pemberton had been expecting a formal recommendation package by the 1st of the month. Nobody had prepared one. The new senior project lead had apparently not known a recommendation package was required, because that context lived in the project history, and in my head and in an email thread that was 300 messages long, and had never been properly summarized into a project brief. The township's infrastructure director had told the VP they were reconsidering whether to continue the partnership. The Pemberton account was worth a projected $2.8 million in Phase 2 work. The VP knocked on my office door about 20 minutes after I sat down. He was a calm man, generally. Former civil engineer, 40 years in the industry, the kind of person who doesn't raise his voice because he's never needed to. He came in, sat down across from me, and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Walk me through the Pemberton file." I did. All of it. The 3-year history, the relationship dynamics, the Phase 2 renewal structure, what the recommendation package needed to include and why, the specific sensitivities around the Phase 2 timeline, the budget variance question that had come up in March, and how I'd originally handled it, and what would need to happen to address it now. I talked for about 40 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Why isn't any of this documented in the project brief?" I said, "Because I was managing it directly. It was in my head and in the email record. When the account was going to be reassigned, I flagged to my director that it would need a proper handoff." I paused. That handoff didn't happen. He looked at me steadily. "Why not?" "I'm not in a position to speak to that. You'd want to ask my director. There was a long pause. He said, "What would it take to get the Pemberton renewal back on track?" I told him. I said I could put together the recommendation package in 3 days if I had access to the file and a meeting with the township coordinator. I said the relationship was recoverable, but it needed someone they trusted to make a direct call and acknowledge the communication gap. I said the Phase 2 timeline concern was addressable, but would require a specific accommodation on one milestone. Nothing that affected the overall budget. Just a sequencing adjustment that the township's council would actually prefer if it was explained correctly. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "What would it take to keep you here?" I'd thought about this moment, maybe more than I'd admitted to myself. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the gray April afternoon, that particular Ontario April that can't quite decide if it's still winter. And I thought about 26 years of making decisions under pressure, of knowing when to push and when to wait, of understanding that the right answer isn't always the satisfying one. I told him I wanted the senior project lead title, with the corresponding pay grade adjustment. I told him I wanted the Pemberton account formally assigned to me with the appropriate documentation. I wanted a written acknowledgement that my informal contributions over the previous 2 years warranted a retroactive review. I wasn't asking for back pay. I was asking for the conversation to be on record. And I told him that going forward I needed clarity about expectations on both sides, because I wasn't willing to operate in an unofficial capacity indefinitely. He said he appreciated the directness. He said he'd need to discuss it with HR and with my director, but that he didn't see significant obstacles. He asked if in the meantime I was willing to make the call to Pemberton. I said I was. The call took 45 minutes. The township coordinator had worked with me long enough to say fairly quickly that she was glad to hear my voice. I acknowledged the communication gap directly, not in a way that threw anyone under the bus, but in a way that was honest, because she deserved honesty after 3 years of a good working relationship. I walked her through the recommendation package structure. I told her what the sequencing adjustment would look like and why I thought her council would actually prefer it. She said she'd bring it back to the infrastructure director. She called back the next morning and said they wanted to continue with Phase 2. The formal offer came down 10 days later. The title was there, the pay adjustment was there. It landed at about $62,000 more annually than I'd been earning, which, when I told my wife that evening, made her put down her tea and look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Was it the right number?" I asked. "It's a fair number," she said. "Is that what you wanted? The money?" I thought about that honestly. "No," I said, "I wanted them to see it." She nodded. "Did they?" I said I thought they were starting to. The new senior project lead is still with the company. He was moved to a different portfolio, commercial clients, which is where his background actually fits. Nobody said anything formal about it. These things rarely get said formally. My director and I have a more clearly defined relationship now, which is to say we both understand what I'm actually responsible for and what he is, and we operate accordingly. It's not warm exactly, but it's functional, and I've made my peace with functional. The Simcoe permit situation eventually got resolved. Took 4 months and a renegotiated milestone schedule, but the project is back on track. I wasn't the one who fixed it, that wasn't mine to fix anymore. But I did answer a few specific technical questions along the way, because the project manager asked, and because they were within scope, and because I'm not actually in the business of watching things fail when I don't need to be. I still drive past the Pemberton site sometimes. There's a stretch of county road between Midland and Penetanguishene where Phase 1 work is visible. New culverts, rebuilt shoulder, a storm drainage upgrade that will serve that community for 40 years if it's maintained right. I know every decision that went into that work. I know where the complications were and how they got resolved. It's not glamorous infrastructure. Nobody's going to put it in a news release. But when you've spent 26 years building things that hold, bridges, systems, the kind of structures that stand up under pressure, you develop a particular feeling about work that lasts. It's quieter than pride, closer to something like satisfaction. My wife asked me once, during all of it, whether I'd do it differently if I could go back. I said I would have put things in writing sooner. The informal arrangements, the unofficial responsibilities, the account relationships, all of it should have been documented earlier and tied formally to compensation. That was my mistake, if I'm being honest about it. I let convenience become a liability. She said that sound like something I'd say. I said, what would you have said? She thought about it. I would have said, don't give away what you can't afford to lose. That's probably better. The team has a new junior analyst who started in February. Sharp, thorough, asks the right questions before she acts on anything. Last week, she came by my office with a question about a contractor pre-qualification process and stayed for 40 minutes because the conversation went somewhere useful. When she left, she said, is it always this complicated? I said, the complications are the job. Once you understand that, the rest gets easier. She looked like she wasn't sure she believed me. She will.